Good poems should always be controversial. If there's not a debate about a poem, it isn't a poem. It's just text on a screen. Oh, okay, so here we go. And you can tell a lot of people read this, 1,500 views without any interaction. Somebody was reading this tweet. I'll just read it. It says, new scoop. Per sources, nearly $1 billion in improperly tested cannabis reached consumers in Massachusetts over recent years due to manipulated yeast and mold results provided by two independent testing labs. An updated bulletin from MA Cannabis, the CCC, is expected within days. So there's a lot to this. Let's unpack a little bit about this. If you've been following my story, of course, you know that I've been putting out reporting over the past year or so indicating that there has been a manipulated testing process being deployed by only a few independent testing labs in the Commonwealth. And to set the tone for this conversation, I just want folks to understand that Massachusetts has very stringent testing standards for both contaminants like total yeast and mold, as well as ostensibly or de jure THC potency. So before a cannabis operator can sell a product on market, a cultivator or a processor or whatever it may be has to take their product, and they can do batch testing, select their own sample, and send it to an independent testing lab. Now let's set aside how poor control it is to have cultivators with a self-interest in pumping results and manipulating batch testing, sending their own products to labs for testing. And by the way, if you want to know what batch testing means, let's take a look at this story I covered a few years ago, and let's find it. Oh, there we go. Batch testing means if your grow has stuff like this in it, which was alleged to be at the Curaleaf facility in Webster, that's an MSO. If your cannabis is contaminated with things like that, then you can just find one of the buds that isn't, or use radiation or ozone remediation to get rid of that contamination for testing, and then all of your product can go to market. Wow, how interesting is that? Well, that's very interesting, isn't it? But let's talk a little bit more about why. Let's set aside sample testing and batch testing and sample selection for a second, because that's part of a larger reform effort. These independent testing labs, their clients are the producers, the cultivators, the manufacturers, the people with the most incentive to find labs who are willing to, one, inflate THC to facilitate sales, and two, manipulate total yeast and mold potency results to facilitate product getting to market that never should have been on market. And you might say to me, Grant, well, this is a scientific method. How would someone manipulate total yeast and mold results? By the way, I will read some of your comments in a second. Just let me talk about this, and it's important to lay the foundation because there are people who watch this stream specifically for coverage of these issues related to the CCC, and I do want to lay this foundation. When you are testing for total yeast and mold, what you're doing is literally testing for total yeast and mold, and you're doing it on a 10,000 CFUG basis. So you're detecting in a sample for total yeast and mold without a specified control list of strains for the total presence of yeast and mold up to 10,000 CFUGs, and then you're reporting a pass or fail. So 9,999 CFUGs, that's a pass. 10,000 CFUGs, that's a fail. So this is a very sensitive process, but at the same time, it is not specific. Now, to test for total yeast and mold, there are two ways to do this. The industry standard is to use something called plating. Now, every type of testing has its own what's called exclusion and inclusion list. Now, plating has an expansive inclusion list, which means it tests for a lot of different strains of total yeast and mold. That's why it's the standard in the agricultural industry or the food processing industry for doing this kind of contaminant testing. But the problem with plating, not for an honest lab, but for a dishonest lab or a lab trying to get a lot of clients, is that plating requires 72 hours of culturing or development or plate growth before an appropriate sample can be taken to measure the presence of contaminants. Now, microbial contamination is a nuanced art form, as anyone who understands the mechanics of this will tell you. I think they're biological chemists. I have so many interesting friends who are biological chemists that work for all these fascinating government agencies, and it is so interesting to talk to them about this, because you realize the level of precision and knowledge that's required to interface with oversight of these competing conflicts of interest in the context of highly complex science that the layperson, much like trying to read law, can't really understand or engage with without the predicate foundation. Okay, so anyway, two ways to measure total yeast and mold. As I mentioned, there's plating, which it takes 72 hours, but is very accurate and precise and has a high inclusion list. So it only misses a few types. I think there's one type of mildew, for example, that 3M plates doesn't catch. But for the most part, it is highly inclusive. But as you can imagine, that will result in a higher fail rate on average in the context of testing for total yeast and mold. In fact, the industry average for total yeast and mold fail rate in the cannabis industry nationally is between 11 and 14%. Now, there's another type of testing, and it actually bifurcates. So for building a schema here, we have two types of testing for contaminants, right? First is the plating method, which takes 72 hours, but is highly specific and is good for honest labs looking to protect the integrity of the public. Although, of course, much like with any type of science, it's possible that it might miss one or two things, like, as I mentioned, the type of yeast or something, one specific type of yeast, and there are a lot of them. Now, the second part of our schema is we're going to talk about something called PCR testing. QPCR testing in particular. And you're going to say to me, oh dear God, Grant, I've heard this come up before in the context of other public health issues. And yes, we are talking about a similar methodology, but what's important to understand is what I'm about to explain to you is the distinction between a plating and a more rapid type of culturing. It's not even really, well, it does involve culturing, but a more rapid type of testing. Now, the first way to do PCR testing, this is somewhat accepted by the scientific community, in my opinion. I am not a representative of them. I just have talked to probably like 75 different people now in this community who focus on this, so I have some understanding of what they think about this. The PCR testing in and of itself is not a problem if the underlying sample submitted to this PCR testing machine is enriched. And what that means is that PCR testing can have a turnaround time of, I think, similar, 48 hours or so, but it's a little bit quicker than plating. But its turnaround time is slowed down if its methodology is deployed correctly, which is to say if the underlying sample is enriched to ensure the PCR testing device can pick up on what might be subtle molecular contamination levels, right? So in the context of both total yeast and mold. The other thing that's important to understand is, unlike the high inclusion list that we see, that people would see in the context of plating, when you're using something like a PCR test, the different companies that put this out, Medicinal Genomics, Pathogen, DX, whatever it may be, they have different inclusion and exclusion lists. And it's also important to remember, and I think I've reported a little bit on what's been happening with medicinal genomics and the evolution in their testing protocol. There's a lot more variability to the testing environment when you're talking about a PCR machine. Now let's talk about something called QPCR, microarray hybridization testing. Now this is a more even rapid type of PCR testing. It's called quick PCR testing. And here's what's very interesting. It can be run on an unenriched sample, which means it doesn't take the same amount of culturing time. And what's even more interesting is the qPCR test that's most commonly used, which is from a company called Pathogen DX, that has an exclusion list that is bigger than, say, like a plating exclusion list. There's an exclusion list for the qPCR testing that applies in the context of both total yeast and mold contamination, whereas the plating methodology, some of the tests only miss like specific forms of yeast. Anyway, so this qPCR methodology uses unenriched samples. And why that's so interesting is if you look at Nevada over the past year or two, what you will see is that the state of Nevada was very concerned about this testing methodology being deployed in its regulated environment. And they required something called an AOAC accreditation in order for the qPCR testing offered by Pathogen DX on unenriched samples to be utilized within their state. And that was approved. But I have looked extensively into the AOAC accreditation process, and I've looked so extensively into it that I know the intimate details of this specific approval and the way in which these machines, unlike conventional plating or even other PCR testing, are leased out to testing labs, and then the results are fed back to Pathogen DX, who has to interpret them and then release the data. Now, I actually have a lot of very interesting information about what Pathogen DX was saying to prospective customers about what it could offer in terms of fail rates, which is a very big problem. And I'm not specifically sure who I'm going to talk to about that yet, but they should know that I'm going to talk to someone about it, and I think it's very deeply concerning. But let's back up a little bit. So you might be saying, okay, Grant, so this is an AOAC accredited methodology, the QPCR microarray hybridization method offered by Pathogen DX. What's the issue here? Well, there's two issues. One, I want to know if the sample that was at the core of the AOAC accreditation was enriched or unenriched. I want to know that. I want to know far more about the nature of that accreditation process, and I think regulators in Nevada should be asking more questions about that as well. Secondly, and this is very important, there is data, and I will pull up said data. Let's see. Yeast and mold testing. I will pull up this data because there is data that I have already analyzed, and I have put up a post to that effect, showing that within the context of the state of Massachusetts, there are specific labs that are churning out failure rates. There we go, under 5%. Look at that, the very first result. So let's read this story. This was from me on November 28, 2023. Breaking exclusive. Data obtained from a FOIA request to the CCC and used to populate the graph below indicates that there is widespread fraud occurring as recently as 2022 in the context of total yeast and mold contaminant testing in the Commonwealth, thus posing a direct and short-term threat to the public health. At least 4 labs in the state have microbial failure rates significantly lower than what would be expected based on Massachusetts and national averages for yeast and mold failures. A fail rate between 4% and 8% would be abnormal, say my sources, and a fail rate below 4% for total yeast and mold would be unheard of. Recently, I've reported that some products on the regulated market in Massachusetts were failing subsequent total yeast and mold tests, and that implies that they passed an initial test, got sold, then went for retesting and failed after a consumer had concerns. Further, I reported that the cause of that manipulation may be rooted in a new type of endpoint PCR with DNA microarray hybridization method for detecting the presence of such yeast and mold, as I was just relaying to you a little bit earlier from memory. Because turnaround time and fail rates are the name of the game when dishonest labs look to attract clients, a method of testing for total yeast and mold that produced rapid results and low fail rates would be a highly sought after methodology piece of equipment. Traditional methods for detecting total yeast and mold would involve plating. A sample grows on a petrofilm over the course of 72 hours and then is tested for microbial contaminants. But new style PCR methods can be deployed on so-called unenriched samples, vastly reducing the 72-hour turnaround time and resulting in far lower fail rates. The data below has clearly been in the possession of the CCC for an extended period of time, and lab fraud is clearly occurring in the Commonwealth in the context of dangerous mold and other bacteria present within the regulated market. Recently, regulators within the agency released a bulletin, the first in a series, informing testing labs that the CCC has moved to prevent other forms of lab fraud in the context of potency testing. That was 5 months ago. So you might be asking, Grant, where's the bulletin on total yeast and mold manipulation? Good question. But there's the data. Look at it. Look at it. Look at the data. And if you want to see each lab by name, I'll zoom out. Lab A, Lab B, Lab E, Lab G, Lab H, Lab O, Lab P, Lab X, Lab Y, Lab Z. Our testing labs. I'm not going to look at that message, by the way. I have other things going on. Look at those results. 0.3% fail rate, abnormality. 2% fail rate, abnormality. 1.7% fail rate, abnormality. 3.6% fail rate, abnormality. And if those labs don't think that if those labs think, those 4 labs for even 1 second, that they are hiding because the data is anonymized, they have another thing coming. It is very easy using COAs to figure out what those labs are. And if they're manipulating this QPCR testing to put dangerous product on the market to attract clients, a reckoning is coming, mark my words. I don't know what you think you're doing, but if the headline is $1 billion worth of manipulated product made it to the market via testing that may not be reliable, in fact, I know for a fact, based on quantitative analysis of the data at hand, is not reliable. You've all created a horrific situation for this regulatory agency, for your clients, for the future of independent testing labs in this state, for the regulatory oversight of what it is that you're all doing, and for the people within the commission, both well-meaning and enablers who facilitated this going on, being subject to the wrath of almost God himself. I'm talking about other government agencies now, for what has happened. You've compromised the integrity of hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars worth of market sales, and you've done it in a way that isn't just misleading people into thinking they're buying cannabis that is more potent than it looks. You've done it in a way that fundamentally threatens the public health because the product that is making it to market has yeast and mold rates that are higher, much higher in some cases, than are allowed per the standards that you regulators and you staff go around touting as the national gold standard. It means nothing if it's subverted via a manipulated testing methodology that you all were put on notice years ago and months ago, and I'm sure recently too, was occurring. And why was it occurring? Because people within your lab department used to work for some of these companies and they had a reason to keep the money going, just like you as a regulatory body had a reason to keep the money flowing. It's a pattern of conduct at this point. I am incredulous at the behavior of some of you within inside that agency who knew full well exactly what you were doing and who knew full well the decisions that you were making. Don't even get me started on that $125,000 fine for one person handing a joint to their family member in a parking lot. Don't even get me started. You all deserve to be under federal investigation. Jesus, do you understand what you've done? Not just in the context of this manipulated contaminant testing, but in the context of the much wider market, the integrity of the market. You've enabled bad actors. You've enabled bad actors to nearly go forward with impunity, despite people yelling from the rooftops that workers, the safety of the public, and the integrity of our regulatory apparatus itself is being threatened by virtue of your perfunctory inaction. And then you want to stand up at public meetings and talk about how workers are dying. That is why I say some of you commissioners stand on the graves of those who have passed away in a manner that undermines your message and it, at best, hypocritical and at worst a red herring. And that's disgraceful. And if you can't tell, by the way, this is how I feel. You deserve to know how I feel because I've watched these hearings for the past 4 years. I know this agency intimately. I know the way in which this agency responds to criticism intimately. And I'm very well familiar with what's going on right now that is creating conditions that make it untenable for this agency to act in the regular course that it was used to when it didn't have eyes on it. So don't think for 1 second that this is going to continue. There will be a reckoning in the form of juridical or federal or state oversight of this situation, whether or not the powers that be within the commission like it, and regardless as to how much they want to retaliate against people for figuring out what was going on. Thank you for allowing me to stand on my soapbox. Now I will look at some of the comments. Oh, okay, good. There's not a lot of comments. It doesn't behoove their actual agenda to keep the laws they made. That's true. Hi, Grant. Hi, Grant. Good to see you all. Oh, that's just the top chat. I should look at all the chat. Oh, good. All right. Not a lot of chat going on. That's a positive thing. All right, so what else do I want to talk about? All right, this is about 15 minutes before the start of the hearing. If you've ever wondered about what testing is like in the Commonwealth for cannabis, you've now just gotten an in-depth overview of how it's done, how it can be manipulated, and why there is an incentive to do same. And I feel that it is very important that the commission move on this outstanding regulatory bulletin related to the specific type of contaminant testing that we're talking about, because the data is clear that these outlier labs, I assure you, commission, if you look into your own data, are all using this type of QPCR method, and I assure you this method was never intended to run on unenriched samples. In fact, the only reason someone would want to do that is if they wanted wanted to achieve an artificial fail rate that was low to attract clients. There you go. QED. That's my mathematical proof. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the NECAN bulletin. So I don't know if I actually posted this up on Twitter. It might be somewhere. In recent days, let's go to the cannabis